Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Debrief. This week, Bishop Strickland on Veritatis Splendor and Amoris Laetitia, the persecution of Catholics in Nicaragua. We'll talk about an Alabama priest abandoning his post, and then the latest and greatest at where Peter is, because it's been a busy couple of weeks. Hey, Mike, welcome back to the show. It's been a while. How have you been?
Long time no see. Well, sorry about the last couple of weeks. It's funny because last week on Monday, and it was an hour difference, and I had meant to reach out to you to tell you that my family was in St. Louis. We were actually in line to get on the arch in
St.
Louis.
You sent me a photo of the arch. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we basically, my family, it had been a long time. We have a lot of friends out in Missouri. And so we drove across the country and went and visited my older daughter's godfather, who's a priest in the Diocese of Jefferson City, Father Dan Mers, who used to work for the USCCB. And one of the days we went out to Jefferson City and saw the cathedral, saw their new Catholic charities, met with Bishop Sean McKnight, who also, when he was a priest, used to work at the USCCB. And then on the final leg, we drove to the St. Louis area. We got to meet Dan and Rachel Amiri and their three children in person for the very first time. And we had dinner at their house Sunday night, and then on Monday we went to the zoo and had dinner with them, and then we drove 13 hours across back to Maryland.
Yep.
So
meanwhile, the news and the world just marches on, and World Youth Day is happening. And all right, so let's get into all of the headlines we're going to cover today. So our first story takes us to Tyler, Texas. Bishop Joseph Strickland is once again stoking controversy on social media. And about a week ago, you wrote an article entitled, "Is Strickland Slouching Towards Schism?" And you cited a tweet in which he shared an article from Crisis magazine charging that John Paul II's encyclical, Veritatis Splendor, and then Pope Francis' exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, cannot be reconciled, and Catholics must choose between the two. In his tweet, he wrote, "Choose wisely. I choose Veritatis Splendor." Mike, why are you concerned about this tweet?
Well, first of all, the error that he makes here is probably the foundational error upon which the site Where Peter is founded, which is the issue of whether or not Amoris Laetitia is Orthodox and whether or not Catholics are bound to grant their assent to this teaching. Amoris Laetitia obviously is Pope Francis's teaching about marriage and the family. In its controversial 8th chapter, it provides a vision of accompaniment, how a pastor might accompany a Catholic or a couple who are in an irregular situation, which could mean that they're cohabitating, which could mean that they, one is divorced and they got civilly remarried. Maybe they got married outside the church. And it provides a pastoral path of accompaniment back to realizing the fullness of the church's teaching. And within those provisions, Pope Francis teaches that there is a possibility of giving the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist in individual cases when the person is not fully culpable of the act of adultery. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so basically, it's one of those things where the Catholic Church teaches that when you are in a state of mortal sin, you should not present yourself for communion. Mortal sin requires full consent of the will. It requires knowledge that it is a mortal sin, and it requires the act to be grave. Now, there's no question that the act is grave because you are engaging in marital activity with someone that's not your spouse. And in terms of knowledge, we shouldn't withhold knowledge from people. But there's that question of the will. Whether someone's in a situation, let's say they've been in this married relationship for 20 years and they've decided to return to the church, and there's a situation where their spouse has an earlier marriage and doesn't want to go through the annulment process. There's some very difficult situations where the person is not entirely culpable. Their own will isn't entirely involved. And so this is a pastoral accommodation, which is a new development, and it does change the discipline that was laid out in John Paul II's document. But Francis's critics have accused him of heresy. They've accused him of moral relativism or situation ethics. They've accused him of saying that grave sin can sometimes become good. The irony here is that in 2016, when the encyclical came, or when the exhortation came out, Bishop Strickland wrote a very highly supportive letter on his blog. Now, that's been removed from his blog. It gives you an error
for really,
and now he's gone on the record about being against Amoris Laetitia, and he's also he doubled down on his radio show, and this just strikes me as who is he listening to? Who is he speaking to? Well, obviously he's sharing an article from Crisis Magazine, but it's discouraging to see this backslide or this slouching in his role as a bishop.
Yeah. And so I think you've got it here. He's described it as separation from the deposit of faith. And
here's the question. So we talked about schism.
Yeah.
And the reason why I use the word schism is very deliberate. Prior to this tweet on his radio show, he said, "I've been accused of schism. Let me tell you what schism is. Schism is separation from the deposit of faith and from the ancient magisterium of the church, and something like that." But Bishop Strickland is a canon lawyer, and canon law is very clear on the definition of schism. Canon 751 says, "Schism is the refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff or of communion with the members of the church subject to him." I don't know why he didn't mention the Pope at all. He's basically saying that the Pope is going into schism. Now, another thing that he regularly tweets is he will identify a priest or a bishop and will say, this person has left the Catholic Church. He said this about cardinals. He said this about archbishops. He even insinuated it regarding the new CDF prefect, Archbishop Fernandez, soon to be Cardinal Fernandez. This is a way of separating himself with, Catholics who are subject to the Pope. And he should know that the way that Catholics look at unity, we call the Pope the guarantor and principle of church unity. He is the visible source of unity in the church. And he has bought into a narrative that does not appreciate the living magisterium and the successor of Peter, who we unify around as Catholics. So I wrote an article. I shared some updates, or I shared some resources where we've specifically addressed Amoris Laetitia and why it is essentially in continuity with Veritatis Splendor. And so if you look at the show notes, the links will be within that article that we share. And if you have any questions about it, we've covered it.
And then there was an apostolic visitation back in June. Do you have any update on that?
So all of it happens under pontifical secrecy. It's a secret process. If there is a result to the visitation, there will be an announcement in the Vatican press office updates where they talk about resignations and appointments and retirements. And so we'll just have to wait for that process to play out. But based on his behavior on social media and on his radio show, he doesn't strike me as someone who's very confident that he's going to remain in office. That's just a sense I get. I don't know. I don't have any inside knowledge other than the way these things tend to go. That's what it looks like to me.
All righty. Let's move on to persecution in Nicaragua. In the last episode of the Debrief, we spoke about how the Nicaraguan government released Bishop Rolando Alvarez, but then rearrested him and returned him to prison the next day. And the latest update on the situation between the Catholic Church and the regime of President Daniel Ortega occurred yesterday when Nicaraguan's government confiscated the University of Central America, which is run by Jesuits. According to the university officials, the government alleged the university was a center for terrorism. Can you give us any more insight into this?
Yes, this is obviously just the next stage in the pressure and the antipathy of the Ortega regime towards the church. They've seized a university, they've arrested bishops, they've arrested priests. In terms of active persecution, it looks like they're stepping up their game and they're not stepping down. Obviously, this is becoming an international situation of freedom of religion. They're alleging it's a center of terrorism because protests against the government 5 or 6 years ago originated from this university. But other than that, there's no violence sponsored by the university or anything like that. And so people are becoming very distressed about this issue. And this is a topic that I think we've definitely reached the point where Catholics really need to pay attention to this.
Wow.
I have an article that we are publishing today. Hopefully it should be up by the time this episode is up. It's one of the rare anonymous articles that we have ever posted on Where Peter Is. And this is because the author has faced some death threats in the past based on involvement in Latin America. So, and we will provide, in addition, plenty of links to update you on this situation, because it is scary, especially on this continent, to see active persecution of the Catholic Church, churches shutting down, universities being closed. I mean, I don't think we've seen anything like this in decades. Hopefully it's not as bad as Mexico in the 1920s, but there's always the potential that this situation could get dramatically worse, and hopefully hopefully something can be done about this. But right now we should remain informed of these issues.
So let's pray for the people of Nicaragua. Our next topic here, we've got a 30-year-old priest, Father Alexander Crow from Mobile. Is it Mobile or Mobile? Pardon me, I don't know.
Mobile is apparently it's the southern accent, so it's Mobile.
All right, Alabama. He was ordained in 2021, and then he left his parish unannounced on July 24th, 2023, with an 18-year-old woman who had graduated from a Catholic high school in Mobile. They were discovered by an uncle of the young woman at an Airbnb in Italy. What's the situation now?
Yeah, so this priest, Father Alexander Crow, he's been reported to be in Italy with this young woman she's 18 years old now, but she was 17. She just graduated from high school in May or June, and he had done some chaplain work. Basically, he's not responded to any interview requests. After she was discovered by family members, her family apparently flew out there, tried to convince her to come home. She would never speak to them without him being present. She insists that this is God's will. This is what she wants to do. This is kind of the parents of the woman are very concerned about the situation, and they allege that Father Crow has groomed multiple young girls in addition to this young woman.
And then apparently some letters written by Father Crow were released by the press?
Yes. So apparently he wrote a letter to the archdiocese claiming that he was still a priest and that he was following Jesus's will, and that, this is what he needed to do. He claims he's not leaving the priesthood. He also wrote a letter to they say it was his brother in some articles, saying that Mary has told him to do this, and he knows that he's going to lose his position. He wrote a letter to the woman on Valentine's Day when she was still 17 years old, I believe. And in this letter, he called her his wife. Now, there's no record that there was any kind of legal marriage that was going on, and she was below the age of legal marriage for Alabama. So I don't think that has happened, but because he seems to be having these spiritual insights, he believes it in a spiritual way. But yeah, he expresses his love for her. He tells her how pretty she is. And apparently they've been cooking up this plan for a while. And made it happen when she was 18.
So what do we know about his background?
Well, so he's a young priest. He was only ordained for, since 2021, I believe, so 2 or 3 years. And from the very beginning, he expressed a very strong interest in exorcism and spiritual warfare. Supposedly in seminary, he ran his own deliverance ministry. He appeared on Tim Gordon's podcast several times saying that he had done exorcisms, and according to the archdiocese or sources within the archdiocese of Mobile, he's never been the official exorcist for the diocese. And this is actually, when I was working at the USCCB, another priest talked about how there was an exorcism conference going on at some event he was at, I think in Rome or somewhere, and he was noting that a lot of the priests there that were attending this other conference, which is different than what it's been in the past. There were these young gung-ho priests who want to fight the devil, and he said that struck him as very unwise, because what you want is a priest who's been a pastor for a long time, who has proven themselves to be balanced, to be discerning, mature. And this is one of the things that we'll tend to notice, is that this obsession with the demonic, this obsession with spiritual warfare takes on a sensational angle. And I mean, we noticed this with Father Utenauer, who was the head of, I think, Human Life
International.
And, he apparently was grooming and abusing women during exorcisms. Father Jeremy Leatherby out in Sacramento, who's since been excommunicated and laicized, is the same. He had, there are reports that he may have been the exorcist, but he also had these one-on-one individual deliverance things with women in his parish or in his ministry. It seems that if you're not spiritually ready for this, to handle such a ministry, and he's tackling it without the permission of his bishop, it can really open yourself up to, maybe it opens them up to the demonic, this obsession. And just another note, he was one of the speakers for that Hope is Fuel conference that was sponsored by Patrick Coffin, and his name's been stripped from the website. Tim Gordon has taken down his podcast, but we have the screenshots that he was on the final roster of speakers for the Hope is Fuel conference. So it's likely he took part in that.
So what's his current status then with the archdiocese?
So the archdiocese has suspended him from ministry. Some news articles say he's been defrocked, which I don't think is defrocked. If it means laicized, that's a process that takes time, but he is suspended. Okay. He's not allowed to present himself as a priest. I think in terms of actual priestly ministry within the institutional church, that phase is over. The police are investigating. They're looking into other accounts of grooming. They're talking to other potential victims of his grooming to see if they can, find a legal mechanism for having him extradited back to the United States. For the time being, the young woman is still with him. She still wants to be with him. So it's, one imagines what this family is going through.
What a mess. Yeah. Gosh. Well, this is tragic. Lastly, let's do a brief wrap up of some of the latest and greatest. There's just been too many news topics and things that you've been talking about the last couple of weeks. So let's see, World Youth Day, and then let's talk about the death penalty. How do you want to start?
Unfortunately, our my trip to Missouri and our the episodes that we missed took place during the ramp up and the wind down of World Youth Day. If on this channel, whether you're listening to the audio or you are watching us on YouTube, the most recent video prior to this one was an hour sit down that I did with Pedro Gabriel and Claire Dominguez, his wife. They actually went to World Youth Day. Pedro is from Portugal. He's from Porto originally, where port wine comes from. And so they went hop, skip, and a jump over to Lisbon. And it was kind of cool because they got press credentials through where
cool.
Peter is. So they were allowed to go to the press briefings. They were allowed to take photographs of the Pope when, he would go for he would come up pretty close. They didn't interact with him directly, but they took part in some of the catechesis. They talked to people regarding the various controversies that popped up. Obviously, whenever a big event comes along, the critics of Pope Francis try to trump up something big to change the direction of the story. At first, it was the attendance, because the original number of registrants was very low. It was like 340,000, but they were looking at the final numbers of the biggest World Youth Days. Well, the final mass of this World Youth Day was over 1.5 million, which, given that it's a small country, there have been some that have been 5 million or 3 million, but 1.5 is a pretty solid number for Lisbon. And Pedro points out that 1/10 of the people in the country of Portugal that day were at the World Youth Day closing mass. Other things about the reverence towards the Blessed Sacrament were covered. There was some, I don't know if Pedro definitely discussed on Twitter and other places. On Sunday morning, the wake-up call came in the form of a priest who happens to be a DJ to raise money for his parish, but he basically did a DJ set that was a mix of like electronic dance music and sacred music and quotes from Pope Francis at about 7:30 in the morning, because a lot of the pilgrims were sleeping in tents or in the open on the field before the mass. So that was, but obviously people found that very inappropriate. But anyway, check out our links. We'll give a link to the previous podcast. We'll provide a link to the article that summarizes the wrap up of the coverage, and definitely dive into that. The other issue, or another issue, is the death penalty. So theologian Robert Fastigi, who is a seminary professor at Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit, has been working for a very long time on, I think since 2018, the matter of the church's teaching on the death penalty. And obviously, if you look at the Catechism of the Council of Trent, and then you look at the first edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church that came out in 1991 or 1992, and then you look at 1997, and then you look at 2018, there's been a shift. There's been a change in the teaching of in the church's teaching on the death penalty. And one of the issues that is being challenged is whether or not we are bound to grant assent to it. What is the magisterial weight of this document? And so he explores the various arguments. Essentially, all of the critics just don't want this teaching to count. They don't want it to effectively say that Catholics cannot support the death penalty. But when you say that the death penalty is inadmissible and Catholics worldwide work for its abolition, I don't know how they can bend around it. But they'll say it's just his personal opinion. They'll say that it's a prudential opinion and we can choose otherwise. They use excuses for having a different opinion. And I think this is he gave me a 25-page article and said he had been working on it since then, and would I be interested in publishing it? And I said, well, would you be willing to break it up into parts? And and he said yes. So we broke it up into 4 parts, and it just finished yesterday. So we'll provide the link to that. That's very thorough. And at the same time, on my Substack, and I may post it on Where Peter Is as well, I take a deeper look at the 1997 teaching, which essentially says that the only reason to use the death penalty that's justifiable would be if there's absolutely no other option. And it's, so I dig into that. Well, what are these, given the principles behind the legitimate use of the death penalty, and given what the church teaches about the legitimate use of lethal force, how do we square the death penalty with this? So I will provide a link to my Substack. it's basically, can the death penalty be used as legitimate defense? I think is the title. It's something like that. And then the final thing about Where Peter Is, keep your eye out for the article on Nicaragua. It'll go into the show notes. And this Sunday, I will be doing a Twitter Spaces at 6:30 Eastern, I believe, 5:30 or 6:30 Eastern. And if you follow me on Twitter, it will be my pinned post. If you're listening to this,
and then it'll be Twitter Spaces, like it's a live audio room.
Yeah, it's a live audio room. It's not recorded. It's a discussion hosted by the author of the piece, and we're just going to discuss how to get the word out about Nicaragua, because it's a very, very harrowing situation, and obviously the Holy See is in they don't want to, just like with China, they can't just come out, although they have condemned and they have expressed concerns for the arrest and for the injustices. And I know that the Father General of the Jesuits spoke out about the universities today, or about the university today. But this is something just for Catholics to be informed. I might be asking more questions than giving answers, but the author asked me to be the guest for this episode. So I am doing my best to become informed, and hopefully we'll be able to provide resources that our readers can go to learn about this ongoing, increasingly urgent and distressing situation.
Thank you. Well, Mike, thanks for the debrief this week. And again, available links to all of these things are in the description. This conversation is brought to you by smartcatholics.com. It's the free online community for millennials, creators, and learners. Join the private Where Peter Is group to ask questions, share insights, and suggest topics for next time.
Yes, and visit wherepeteris.com to read articles, commentaries, and reflections by and for faithful Catholics who support the mission and vision of Pope Francis.
Please hit the like button and then do subscribe to the Where Peter Is channel so that you never miss an episode of the Debrief.
And if you can spare a few bucks, support Where Peter Is on Patreon to help us continue bringing you this show and other edifying content.
Thanks for joining us, friends. When it comes to news and controversies in the Catholic Church, stay curious, informed, and engaged. God bless you.
Goodbye.